So we have reached the final day and the last day of the conference. We have a fantastic keynote speaker, two sessions and one round table. So I'm very uh, privileged and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Anindya Sinha. We fondly call him Ranada. Now that you're in Gujarat, we'll call you Rana Bhai. So I know Rana from my master's uh, days in Dehradun, where I was doing my master's in wildlife sciences. And Rana was there as a visiting faculty to teach us animal behavior. So his classes was really fun. Most of our classes were outside the classroom, on the corridor, along the stairs, sitting and chatting, sometimes in the canteen. But one episode I would like to share is when we went to the outside the campus for a monkey watching exercise. It was a monkey watching animal behavior assignment. So we were dropped in different places in along the Dehradun Delhi highway, and then Rana was on the bike between the multiple students group. So we were two students along the highway, and then slowly we started to see macaques coming down. So the road is there, and on this side there were students, and that side there were monkeys. So it was a very interesting exercise. We did focal animal sampling, and then we did time activity budget. So we observed monkeys. What was interesting is that as we were walking, monkeys were also walking along with us. And maybe for food or what, we don't know. But what was interesting is that we were pretending not to observe them. So we would look at the monkeys and make notes. And then sometimes it was very interesting that maybe monkeys also thought that, they are acting, so we will also act. So, but something, at the end, what happened around 3 or 4 o'clock, something interesting happened. All the monkeys went to the temple. There was a Shiv temple on the highway. And then we also went. There were prasad distribution. We had prasad. Monkeys also had prasad, and we came back. So very fantastic. So really, we really had fun, and we loved all his classes. So Professor Anindya Sinha Rana is now is a professor in National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. And in addition to that, he is associated with Nature Conservation Foundation, Center for Neuroscience of the Indian Institute of Sciences, and with National Center for Biological Sciences, both in Bangalore. And he's also affiliated with Cotton University in Guwahati, College of Humanities, Exeter University, and in Department of Geography, Cambridge. His earlier training is in botany, and with specialization in cytogenetics at the Calcutta University. And his PhD was in molecular biology in 1993 from TIFR. And he has worked in the field of biochemical genetics, molecular biology of carbohydrate metabolism in Baker's yeast. That was your PhD. Yeah. And for many years, he's been working in behavioral biology of wasps, social cognition in macaques, classical genetics of human disease, and the philosophy of human non-human species relations, which he studied at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and with NCBS in Bangalore. But his current research interests for the last 3 decades are in the field of animal behavioral ecology, cognitive ethnology, evolutionary biology, population and behavioral genetics, urban animal studies, particularly primates, ungulates, canids, and he also studies philosophy of biology, performance studies, and the intangible and the tangible values of cultural heritage in India. And he's deeply interested in biology education. In 2001, he established a master's degree course in wildlife biology and conservation in Bangalore. So please join me in welcoming Ranada.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I audible to everyone? Yeah. Thank you very much, Ambika, Orko, and Nishant in alphabetical order for having me here. It's wonderful to be here, and I will tell you that I honestly admit that I'm filled with great trepidation because the subject that I'm going to speak about are issues that only recently I've been thinking about academically. But as Ambika said, when we went back, which year was that? 2001. Just tells you how old she is and how old I am. But as you could see that the experiences we had were very affective right then, and she remembers them, and I don't know if the monkeys are alive today. I'm sure they would have some semblance of memory somewhere there as well. But I think we do live in very exciting times. And I say this because the social sciences, and again, I will tell you that I'm a new entrant into this, the social sciences have been witnessing what one could call an animal turn. So questions about how animals configure space, interact with people, are enmeshed in the broader dynamics of accumulation, surveillance, control, or which were only at the margins of social theory about 2 decades ago, are becoming increasingly important as valid areas of inquiry. And what is most significant for us, and when I say us, I mean particularly my close friend and collaborator, Man Borua, who is right now in Cambridge University, and we have sort of, we've argued that we've now moved, and our emphasis in the social sciences has been moving from an emphasis on animal geographies to what one could call animals geographies, because now we need to attend to the sentient lives of animals and their dwelt geographies within wider anthropogenic, social, and political economic contexts. This turn to animal geographies have in many ways been promissory. Whilst it is true that geographers have been adept at conceptual innovations within their domains of inquiry, more multidisciplinary methodological engagements with animal lives and ethnographic accounts of heterogeneous relations that compose nature are clearly lagging behind. And as has been persuasively argued by David Lulka in 2009 or Henry Buller in 2014, we need to start looking at animals, as beings, rather than from outside as humans. And I stand here today, I hope to be able to persuade you, and this is my earnest ethical appeal, the ethos in my address, that there can be no better plunge to take than to dive into the depths of the science of ethology, which has been broadly understood to encompass biological studies of the patterns of animal behavior under natural conditions. Studies on animals within animal behavior or ethology have classically been to understand animal responses to a whole myriad of stimuli that they might receive from their surroundings. But although this has all been embedded in a belief that all responses are behaviors innately wired by the composition and variance in the genetic material of these animals, right? Oh, I'm sorry, I had some slides on this, I think, which I forgot about. Ooh. Oh, I have to switch this on. Can you? Okay. Could you do that? Thank you. Can you? Oh, okay. So I have to tell you this, that I'm sorry, I'm backtracking a bit. Most of my talks are inspired by cinema, or sometimes maybe literature as well. So I'm sure, do you know where this quote is from? Because this is an important part of my talk. It's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me. Yes! Can you just, the next please? Christopher Nolan, Batman Begins, 2005. And he couldn't have been more philosophical than that as far as my talk goes today. Could you just go to the next slide? So this is what broadly I've been talking about, is that we've been living with animals for very long periods of time, but we've not really tried to understand them experientially as animals would. And I think it's time to experience that, which many of us have done in our own personal domains, but to bring that into the broad sort of academic stream, I think is important. Could you go to the next one, please? Okay, so let's just hang on there. So as I was saying that the entire belief has been, even in ethology, that animals are still responding in some ways. All their decisions are in response to certain stimuli in the environment. One of the people who actually questioned this was Dominique Lestel, who in 2006 wrote a very spirited paper, which inspired me much later, of course, where he said, rather disparagingly, that ethology is a science of control, within which the bodies of animals are seen as machines and whose behaviors are to be learned and controlled. That's how traditionally ethology has been looked at. And However, today when we look at animals, their movements, their interactions with their surroundings, with us so closely, I'm convinced that much more richer studies of affective environments, of sentient, acting, decision-making, possibly subjective, non-human beings are not only possible, but should be attempted. In fact, Maan and I have argued in 2017 that the time is right for us to develop what we call ethogeographies, which would enable much thicker accounts of non-human worlds. Right. So in this talk, I will therefore attempt to map into the affective world of primates, focusing on bonnet macaques, a species I've been studying now close to 26, 27 years, and on humans. And these are both primate species that have lived in very close physical and emotional proximity across peninsular India over thousands of years. There is also the rhesus macaque in North India, which many of you know about, which has also had a very, very interesting, though checkered history of existence with human communities. I will investigate affective ethologies in primate lives in 3 registers. First, I will turn to affects as it is sensed by non-humans themselves, including inter-individual communication, bonding, or the forging of behavioral performances within the community. Second, I will discuss interspecies affects, particularly forms of communication that have emerged recently in macaques in certain anthropogenic contexts, including novel forms of communication which are directed by the macaques only towards humans and never to other macaques. And finally, I will examine how humans respond to encounters generated by these macaques, paying attention to the role that affect plays in forging sentient and often durable relations between the 2 species. And I will then conclude with reflections on what affective ethologies may offer up for differentiating and writing richer geographies of non-human life worlds, which we believe should form the essential blueprint of a sustainable future. Right. Can I go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So again, I will now turn to the natural philosophies, and we seem to have, I think, rather tragically overlooked Gilles Deleuze's very powerful suggestion in 1988, and I've written it here, but I quote him: studies which define bodies, animals or humans, by the affects they are capable of, founded what is today called ethology, something that we seem to have forgotten. This approach is no less valid for us, for human beings, than for animals, because no one knows ahead of time the affects one is capable of. And don't we know this? Aren't we seeing this in our lives around us even today as I speak? And I think this was prophetic. It was very prescient, but somehow we ethologists seem to have overlooked it. And I think the time has come to relook at what Deleuze was actually telling us a long time ago. And therefore, we hope a more serious engagement will now begin between ethology, between animal geography, between the social sciences. And I do hope that, even as I speak, I hope I'm no Don Quixote running off to fight some imaginary windmills. I do think it's important to consider very seriously appeals made by certain disciplines of animal geography, which go by the name of emotional geography or affectual geography, which have made fairly early attempts to understand the place of emotions and affects within geography. And there is this wonderful paper by Steve Pyle in 2010, where he refers to ways of knowing, being, and doing, where he talks about how different branches of geography treat affect in very, very different ways. For emotional geography, and these are sometimes very, very contradictory, which makes it even more exciting to pursue it. And I think all of us have had a glimpse of that over the past 2 days, when every speaker who has stood here has perhaps defined affect in very, very different ways. And so for emotional geography, affect is a psychological object, an object of the mind, and hence cognitive in nature. But affectual geography, on the other hand, treats affect as a non or a pre-psychological object, and therefore it becomes precognitive in nature. And as you can see, the 2 branches of geography are completely going contrary to each other, but that's what I guess makes a field exciting, because different people bring in different bearings onto something. So the definite meaning of the word affect remains elusive. And Nigel Thrift, who interestingly never agrees with what Pyle says, suggested even earlier in 2004 that there is no one way to define affect. And they are, of course, as I said, both right, at least from a very multidisciplinary perspective. Brian Masumi, even earlier in 2002, took off from the work of Deleuze and from Baruch Spinoza's work and suggested that affect should be defined as what he called intensity. He interprets Deleuze's and Guattari's understandings of affect, again following Spinoza, as the capacity of bodies to affect and be affected by other bodies, be they human, non-human, animate, inanimate. Ben Anderson, working along similar lines, defines affect in 2006, and I quote him here, as a transpersonal capacity which a body has to be affected through an affection and to affect as a result of modifications, unquote. I must also point out here that affect is thus not constrained within any one body. It flows through them, creating an affectual environment. Thus, it is not personal, it's transpersonal. The body thus ceases to exist as a single subjective political unit, and the interactions between bodies, their environments, their movements becomes the subject of interest. Thus, again, as Ben Anderson suggests, an affect does not simply exist, but it emerges de novo out of interactions and encounters between bodies. And that's how I will look at affect for the rest of my talk. Now, these suggestions, I think, provide us with a very novel, functional approach to define and characterize affect. Can I go to the next slide, please? And as you will realize that for biologists, it's extremely important to have a functional definition, because otherwise, if I want to study a phenomenon which has only dwelt in theory or in philosophy, if I want to bring it to the field, if I want to look at it empirically, I need very clear definitions, right? We may choose to disagree on these definitions, but then that's what these discussions are for, right? And Mann and I therefore suggested in 2017 that ethology might be important for geography in terms of exploring the spaces which are occupied both by humans and animals, and what we call hybrid spaces, which therefore generate accounts of knowledgeability amongst animals, understanding how these can profoundly affect human lives, and finally, by examining how these shared ecologies can be sensed differently by the differently interacting bodies, especially keeping non-humans at the center, because that's my own personal bias. So even though we might not precisely know what animals feel or think, an inquiry of affect in animal lives can possibly help us to understand what and how these precognitive intensities flow across bodies, humans and non-humans alike, and what kinds of affects and effects they have on one another. Affect then can also be written, as Nat O'Grady suggests in 2018, and I quote him, ever dynamic processes involving experiences, encounters, and performances between the lives of humans and non-human bodies within material space, unquote, right? So I will also suggest here that the way of looking affect as precognitive, as in some sense a sensory response that we've been talking about since yesterday, also frees me from having to establish cognitive mechanisms, which are often a great difficulty when we are dealing with non-verbal non-humans who cannot talk to us. Please remember that much of what I understand of your consciousness is because what you tell me. And if you were mute, or if you did not speak to me, I could spend a lifetime living with you without ever being able to figure out from your behavior whether you're conscious or not. So that will bring home the message that it is not easy to talk about consciousness, though it's experiential, simply because we cannot be the other in that sense, right? Could I have the next slide? So non-human life has very traditionally coexisted, and rather in earlier times peacefully, with human communities across the Indian subcontinent. The two primary underlying reasons for this being the spirituality that is believed to be shared between human and non-human beings, and secondly, the exalted positions that many life forms have held in the religious beliefs of different Indian communities. This once splendid coexistence has also promoted, since times immemorial, rather sincere efforts by many human communities to reach out to various species with which they have shared their lives, to understand them, to speak about them, write about them, perform about them, represent them in their own daily activities, and even occasionally attempt to directly communicate with them. And nowhere is this more elegantly evidenced than in Indian traditional arts. One example being a poem that I will show in the next slide, which remarkably is by Muttamochiyar, a poet from the Tamil Sangam period, and this is about 2,000 years ago when he writes, and I'll just read it out. When the monkey on the bough of the jackfruit tree in the town's commons mistakes for fruit the eye on the thronged drumheads hung up there by mendicant bards, he taps on it, and the sound rouses the male swans below to answering song. Now, I cannot imagine a more beautiful description of the unconscious, impulsive, and yet affective communication between two non-human species, but with the silent, passive presence of the human between them, because after all, they meet in the town's commons. And this also brings home to us that for 2,000 years at least, we have lived with non-humans in very, very close proximity. And yet when we think of how much we understand their experiences or their decisions, it's pitifully small. We seem to have actually not made too many great attempts to really understand them in more ways. Right. Now, if I can go to the next slide. Amongst wild species, non-human primates appear to be the closest to us, both emotionally and spiritually, inviting an intimacy that could possibly be founded in our close evolutionary relationships with them. The macaques represent arguably the most adaptable and evolutionarily successful of all Indian primates, and include within them two particular species, the bonnet macaque, which you see on the right, which is endemic to peninsular India, only found there, and the rhesus macaque, which of course has a very wide distribution, second only to humans, right from Afghanistan in the west to Japan, China in the east. And both of these species have been referred to by Flavel Richard and his colleagues in 1989 as weed macaques. And the reason why they've been called weed macaques is because, as I've written there, they have a remarkable ability to successfully adapt to almost any kind of environment, both natural and anthropogenic, and display an inherent tendency to actually move towards human settlements, establishing in the process very close commensal relationships with different human communities, and most importantly, setting in motion an inexorable process of what we call synerbization, or urbanization of their life worlds. And this process of urbanization, which Man and I have been exploring to some extent now, begins right there in the forests. It's not, so in some sense, we are bringing the city to the monkeys in the forest, and that I think is an extremely important process that we need to understand. And I'll talk a bit about that a little as I go along. So what we propose to do is to generate much richer articulations of macaque life worlds, including relations between individuals and what these might tell us about the sentient lives of these species. And in the course of such understandings, we might then be able to get a glimpse of non-human affects and how environments that they inhabit can be affective in turn. The next slide, please. And let me therefore, for these purposes, turn to the bonnet macaque, which is a very socially complex but behaviorally very flexible species, endemic to but found ubiquitously across peninsular India, including a wide range of ecologies from wet evergreen forests through dry deciduous forests, arid scrub jungles, and I can tell you, and for those of you who live in the south, there is no town, there is no city in South India that does not have the bonnet macaque. That's how ubiquitous there is. Let me quickly go through some jargon here, just to give you a feel for what it is like to be the species. As I said, it has a wide distribution, but they have group sizes which vary enormously. The females are what are called philopatric, which means they live their entire lives largely within the troops that they are born in, and set up very strong linear dominance hierarchies, which fascinatingly are cultural. It's like being born in a Brahmin family. If you are a daughter of a dominant female, you are dominant. You could be blind, you can be lame, it doesn't matter. And therein lies a story of how perhaps affectively animals seem to recognize positions of others in the dominance hierarchy, and I will talk about that a little more later. Males, of course, like in our species, have much more complex lives. They emerge from their natal troops, go join other groups, but some of them stay back all their lives. Even if they go somewhere, they may come back, they may go elsewhere, they may go nowhere, right? And the hierarchies that they set up, unlike that of the females, is biological. You're strong, you go up in the hierarchy. As you age, you fall from the hierarchy. Very simple. And however, their rise and fall is also influenced by the social bonds that they set up with each other, how well they fight with each other, and also, as we've now shown, how well they're able to cheat each other, which helps them to rise in the hierarchy. The society is promiscuous, periodic consortships, ample mating opportunities. Every male gets a chance to mate with every female and vice versa. Mutual tolerance amongst males and amongst females for their mating efforts, and very, very subtle female mate choice, which we missed for a very long time ago. Right, now 2 take-home messages from these slides. Their hairstyles are very different, and that allows us to recognize them. Over the last 20 years, we've been working on one particular population in Bandipur Mudumalai National Park, where we now know more than 2,000 individuals by face. They are not all there at the same time. There's a turnover, but we know them. But the point I want to make here is that they have personalities, they have behavioral profiles, which makes each of them unique. No 2 of them, like us in this room, are identical in anything that they do. And you have to take my word for it, or come and join me, and you will see this. Okay, could we go to the next slide, please, Ambika? Yeah, and I want to point out here, that's the other take-home message, that they don't live very simple lives. The complexity that they have comes from 2 levels. The level of the individual, where you have a very rich repertoire of communicative behaviors that facilitate individual expression and allow them to develop complex social relationships. But the complexity can also come from society, where you have groups of individuals of very different ages, sexes, and there's an entire debate here which Shayan and I have been having about why we call them sexes, why not genders, but that's another story. Dominance, ranks, kinship, but cutting across these broad biological categories, there are subgroups, temporary alliances, long-term relationships, which we still do not understand how they are forged. Therefore, in evolutionary terms, there are 2 effects of having such a complex life. One, you have a network of associations and interactions over space, where you have different alternative strategies for survival and reproduction, and I point these 2 out because that's the currency for non-human evolution, by and large. I'm leaving humans out of it for the time being. Secondly, over time, longitudinally, they live in very long-lived groups, with individuals can pursue a number of different strategies during their lifetimes. And I'm sure you know, it's not the same living with parents versus partners versus children. Hopefully, we don't have to do that in the future, but in case we do, each is a unique social environment, and you have to continuously adjust to this, and so do the macaques. Right. Okay. Now, so we therefore expect that when we look at generations of these non-human individuals as they live in their groups, we will see that the non-human affective environments themselves change, and affect emerges out of and simultaneously influences these various transpersonal behavioral exchanges that happen between 2 or more individual bodies. But before we start to discuss that, one of the most important aspects of affective communication, because that's what I'm going to address next, and what requires some initial discussion, is intentionality, right? So can I go to the next slide, please? Yeah. So in folk psychology, an attribution of intentionality would require an invocation of mental states, including beliefs, desires, or intentions, which drive individual actors to display behaviors in order to achieve certain goals. It has generally been suggested that intentional communication in humans requires an understanding of the mental state of articulators, which in turn necessitates complex cognitive capacities. Subsequently, intentionality in animal communication systems was operationalized through different orders of intentionality by Daniel Dennett in a series of publications between 1983 and 1988. If I may have the next slide, and I've broadly sort of outlined what Dennett was saying. He put forward a theoretical framework to investigate the attribution of mental states, and a mental state which could be any belief you have, any desire, any emotion right now, you want to run out of this talk and have a cup of coffee, or you want to fall asleep, all of which shows that you have a particular mental state, which in a sense biologically defines the mind. But what Dennett went on to explore are different levels of intentionality. So if you had a being which was completely affective, in the sense it had no intentionality, and here I'm distinguishing between them, though some authors have brought them back together, and I'll talk about that. You could have a zero-order intentional being which has no beliefs or desires at all, and all behavior is just neurological circuits of a very simple nature. So if my bonnet macaque, on seeing a leopard, gives an alarm call, it could just be that the sight of the leopard elicits the alarm call. There is no belief, no desire. And then the bonnet macaque becomes a zero-order intentional system. However, it could become a first-order system where it believes there's a leopard and gives an alarm call, and other individuals run up the trees because they believe there's a leopard there on hearing this call, right? So that's a first-order being. However, you could then have higher orders of intentionality. The bonnet macaque could give the alarm call because it believes that there's a leopard there and it wants others to believe that there is a leopard there, second order. Or the bonnet macaque could give an alarm call because he wants others to believe that he believes in the leopard, third order. That's what we all are in this room. How do we know that? I believe, and I want you to believe, that I believe bonnet macaques have intentionality. The fact that I'm able to give this lecture, the fact that we are able to have a conversation, I can teach, or actually for that matter, I can cheat. All of this happens because we have third order intentionality. And the important question then becomes, and then it asks this question, how do we look at other beings? Can we decipher what kind of intentional beings they are? Right? Now, although such a mentalistic approach is actually practically helpful to define intentionality in human communication, as I just told you, recent studies, particularly those of Simon Townsend and his colleagues in a very landmark paper in 2017, they have suggested, and this is critical for what I'm going to say for the rest of my talk, that mental state attribution is very difficult to establish empirically, as I also mentioned to you earlier, and should not, therefore, perhaps be a necessary criterion to typify intentional communication in non-humans. Simply because I cannot understand their mind, their decisions, as if I were them, I do not know whether I can even invoke a mind in them. So is it now time for us to move away from these kind of mentalisms and try and develop certain behavioral criteria which could then qualify a communicative signal to be intentional, in the sense that an individual performs an act in a goal-directed fashion with the aim of changing the behavior of another individual. As simple as that. Right? And so two of my colleagues, Srijata Gupta and Advait Deshpande and I, actually worked together to suggest that we could perhaps consider communication that effectively changes the behavior of another individual as a marker of intentional use of signals, irrespective of the underlying mental states of the signaler or the receiver, which, as I mentioned earlier, are empirically extremely difficult to establish. Although there appears to be some debate on the relationship between intentionality and affect, Don Welton, in 2012, interestingly, to negate all that I was saying earlier, identified basic affects to consist of needs, wants, or desires, and he suggested that they belong to the same realm, which also includes what have usually been identified as intentional acts, akin to the mental states that I talked about while talking of Dennett. Functionally then, these basic affects that Welton talks about sets the conditions within which intentional acts are played out. At the same time, these affects cannot be merely reduced to bodily sensations per se. Welton thus insists that affects are fundamental to any dynamic account of action, with their efficacy attributable to the sense in which they are both intentional as well as embodied in nature. In this particular context, it may also not be inappropriate to ally our understandings of affect with yet another alternative approach of cognitive complexity, which tried to understand non-human social interactions from a completely different perspective, which is now called distributed cognition. Right. And interestingly, this came from Christine Johnson, who's a computer scientist. And while working with artificial intelligence, she faced this dilemma of how do I define the mind? And therefore, she wanted functional definitions. And I've just sort of listed it, basically what she and Oswald also later talk about in 2001. They had two papers which were very influential within a limited domain of application, of course. Communicative interactions, she called, were directly observable cognitive events rather than our use of behavior to infer invisible mental states such as intentions, which she said for all practical purposes may not even exist. So she embedded cognition within the social interactions of primates and their manifestation through the behavioral coordination of interacting bodies. If I suddenly look at the door and all of you follow my gaze and look at the door, we have achieved a manifestation of what she calls distributed cognition. It's a useful approach for modeling developmental and evolutionary processes, including social learning and the appearance of social traditions or cultures through behavioral transmission, and it does not necessarily preclude the appearance of mental representation capabilities over space and time in individuals in certain contexts and perhaps in later stages of cognitive evolution. So independently of whether we are able to establish mentalism or not, we can still perhaps effectively understand distributed cognition by looking at the interactions of bodies, which is exactly what Welton and other thinkers have been saying before this. Right. Okay. So if I can just go to the next slide. So to return back to our earlier discussion, if we are able to define certain behavioral observations as being affective in nature or as being intentional in nature, depending on how you understand the relationship of these two concepts, we find we can define certain kinds of communicative actions as being indicative of intentional behavior. First, the social use of the communicative act as indicated by the signal being directed to particular recipients, modified by various factors such as the presence or composition of the attendant audience. I look and I see Ambika is falling asleep. I can go and say, Ambika, listen to me. So that is my first criterion. That shows intentionality. It shows a very purposeful affective environment that I generate. Second, there is a sensitivity of the signaler to the attentional states of the recipients, a manipulation of the attentional states of recipients to attract attention, saying, hey, listen to me. Particularly when a mutual attention state between the signaler and recipient is absent, or the signaler moves itself into the line of view of recipient, so I can go and stand there and wave in front of Ambika so that she has no choice but to look at me. And finally, the persistence in the production and elaboration of the signal until the desired communicative goal is met. Have you understood me? That's the point. If I'm not, I will repeat what I said. All of these show that I can intentionally communicate with you, but also remember that the first four of these are crucial to establish intentional signaling, are essentially affective in nature, while the last, of course, is a testimony to goal-directedness. It signifies the purpose of such behavior that I'm showing now. So in order to understand the affective nature of non-human primate communicative signals, let me now turn to an analysis of intentional as also referential gestural communication in wild bonnet macaques. First, with conspecific macaques within their communities, and secondly, outside their groups with members of another species, namely humans. Can I go to the next slide? Okay, now hopefully this will work. So let me just show you this. Here are two macaques, and the juvenile solicits grooming. and the other individual responds. But then he doesn't like it there, turns around and presents another part which she responds to. Now, non-human primate gestures, which we talked about, the fact that the juvenile presented itself to her in particular ways itself is a gesture. These are discrete, mechanically ineffective movements of body parts which are deployed intentionally with the aim of eliciting a behavioral response from the recipient. Gestures that constitute innate signals which can be used in intentional ways to convey particular meaning in communicative contexts. Now, it's important, and the reason I stressed on this is that the sense signals need to be mechanically ineffective, right? Indicating that they do not physically enforce the recipient to produce a response. The responses are thus necessarily voluntary and in our context could be considered affective. For example, a mother's physically picking up of her eager infant would be considered a mechanically effective action, while one that involves her extending her arms towards her child with her palms out and which leads to the child rushing into her arms would be considered a mechanically ineffective but an affective gesture, right? So the criterion of mechanical ineffectiveness does not, of course, exclude potential gestures that are tactile or gestures that involve the signaler coming into direct physical contact with the recipient. In such cases, a tactile gesture must have an affective response that is voluntarily executed by the recipient and is not a mere physical reaction to the action. Thus, let me give you two instances. If there is an accidental collision between two individuals, which results in one falling down, this is not a gesture-response pair, nor is a slap. If I slap someone and the individual moves his or her face away from the point of contact, that is also not a gesture-response pair. However, if I slap someone, and that individual then shows a behavior which is not a direct physical response. It could be running away, it could be turning its back to me, it could be any of the others. Then this would constitute an affective gesture response pair. So the affect has communicated. It has been affected by my action. Yeah. To the best of our knowledge, actually the previous slide, sorry. To the best of our knowledge, the only documentation of truly affective, yet referential, gestural communication which is directed by monkeys towards other monkeys, actually from the wild, came from our earlier studies in Bandipur National Park, which I was talking about. Katya Liebal and her colleagues suggested in 2013, referential gesturing typically directs the attention of the receiver to the sender's object of interest, and the meaning of the referent is deciphered through an understanding of the communicative intent of the signaler. A referential communicative signal, by definition, is thus produced during a joint attention state of the actor and the target and allows for the signaler to attract the attention of the audience to a third external entity. So if I point to that water bottle and all of you look at it, I have shown you a referential gesture, which you've been able to understand, and you're able to interpret the intentionality with which I have pointed to that object. Referentiality, then, is typically determined from a direct relation of the displayed gesture to the external referent, while the intentionality behind the production of such a gesture is usually established, as I described earlier, by the presence of other behavioral attributes such as response, weighting, persistence, gaze alteration, monitoring of attention states, and so on. Now, during these the previous slide again. During the sort of the allo-grooming interactions, which I've shown here, I observed, and this is what I showed in the video clip earlier, certain individuals who are being groomed, or who we call groomees, occasionally displayed 4 distinct gestures. 1, a position change, which you saw in that video clip, a head or body extension, some part of the body, showing the rear part of the body, which you also saw in the previous video, or holding a body part up, which are all directed towards the individuals who's grooming them, or the groomers. Now, when a groomee appeared to indicate a specific part of its body by showing any of these behavioral gestures, the groomer responded often immediately by grooming that part of the body. The referential nature of these 4 gestures was further highlighted by our observations of 4 particular instances in which the groomer actually reached out to allogroom the newly indicated body part, in spite of other more accessible body parts being there right in front of it. The underlying referentiality of these gestures thus seem to have been comprehended by the groomer, suggesting that the recognition of these self-referential gestures could be mediated by directed affective exchanges that may now form part of the innate behavioral repertoire of the species. Taking off from there, and I don't have much time to talk about this, we have now also documented social knowledge amongst female bonnet macaques that may be uniquely affective in nature. We recorded a particular kind of a competition, competitive interaction for access to grooming partners between adult females, which we call allogrooming supplants. So it's a bit like this. Ambika and I are talking to each other, and let us say Ambika is dominant to me, so I'm the most subordinate female, or at least between the two of us, I'm the subordinate female and she's the dominant female, which by the way is true. And then there's a third individual, Orko, who's dominant to both of us, and there's no doubt in anyone's mind here that it's true. Orko approaches us from there. So we both look at Orko, and in most of the cases, and this could be any individual in the room as long as the dominance relationship is maintained and you're female, I disappear. Every time Ambika and I are talking, and Orko, or Nishant for that matter, who's also dominant, appears, I go away. So what is the simple interpretation? I cannot tolerate 2 dominant individuals together, and I decide to go. However, we saw a certain fraction of events where Ambika left, right? So Orko or Nishant are coming in, they're dominant to both of us, and I should have gone, but I didn't go. She went. And many other people have seen this in other species, and they all called it, you know, just a quirk. Oops, my slides disappeared. Okay, thank you very much. Oh, sorry, what is it? Sorry. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Right, so what we then found, and I'm cutting a very, very long story short, is all the instances where I went, and let's now assume that I'm dominant to a few other, every time that Ambika went, and she's dominant to a few other individuals in this room, so she, even as the dominant member of this dyad, left when a further dominant individual was coming, was correlated with the social attractiveness of this subordinate individual, the most subordinate individual. What does social attractiveness mean? And I'm not going into the technical details. Whenever, independent of all these interactions, if you look across a long term, and we looked at it over 4 years of intense study on this troop, whenever a particular female is groomed at very high levels, uniformly by all other individuals, females in the group, this female is socially attractive. So I, of course, talk all the time, but if I'm only talking to Ambika and no one else, then I'm not really a socially garrulous individual in this case. If I'm talking uniformly with everyone, then I become socially garrulous. And so a socially attractive bonnet macaque female is one who gets groomed, even though she is very subordinate, she gets groomed by all the other females in the group at uniformly high levels. And whenever such a female was present as a part of the dyad, the dominant individual decided to go away. Right. Now, so this therefore indicated, and I'll just say it again, the conclusion is that the dominant female of the allogrooming dyad could have actually been aware of the social attractiveness of the individual that she was with, and accordingly tended to retreat when approached by a still more dominant female. This, we believe, is an example of an affective response by the two females to the third approaching female. The more socially attractive, though subordinate, most subordinate member of the dyad took a decision not to move away, which of course she would have had she not been a highly socially attractive individual. But what's also interesting is that the dominant individual, in this case Ambika, moved away as if she had attributed to the approaching dominant female Orko a desire to preferentially associate with her subordinate allogrooming partner, me. She may be dominant to me, she would have stayed, I should have gone, but when she feels Orko is actually wanting to talk to me, she decides to go. That, in some sense, is analogically what seems to be happening, and we've documented this even using mathematical models to show that these factors become important while taking such a decision. So this, to my mind, of course, there can be a number of cognitive explanations that we have tried to do. I figured it out now. I'm a bit slow. So there could be a whole range of cognitive mechanisms that we could invoke, but I think the beauty of it is we don't need to. I think somewhere when we are sitting together and Orko moves in, it generates an affective environment of a complex nature, which this leads Ambika to decide that this is a time when she should go, though normally she wouldn't have, and for me to stay, though I should have gone. Right? And this, I think, is fascinating, and we need to perhaps explore these more. Let us now turn to non-human, human interspecies affects, and finally this slide. And here I would like to emphasize how non-humans themselves might generate particular sets of encounters with humans on their own terms. There is thus a gentle shift, in some sense, I would say, from this dichotomy or the separation of animal spaces or the human ordering of animal spaces from that of what has been called beastly places, which is the animal's own geographies and their sentient inhabitation of the world. From this divide, we now actually move to a more direct focus on the nature of the interspecific encounters that are triggered by the animals themselves and which are directed very clearly towards humans, another species. Right? Now, our long-term studies on wild bonnet macaques have discovered that a certain population of this species that lives in Bandipur has a social organization which is largely multi-male, multi-female. A large number of males and females live together. However, in very recent years, about 30, 35 years, we now have a very high proportion of a completely different social formation, a high proportion of small but reasonably stable unimale multi-female groups with very unique demographic and behavioral features, which I'm not going to get into. So basically, from a multi-male, multi-female association, which is stable, we now have another stable organization where there is one adult male with several adult females. And that's a story by itself, which I won't go into. However, the important point here is that the reason why this new social formation has appeared seems to be because of the tourists who have regularly been driving through Bandipur and Mudumalai from Mysore to Ooty. In fact, it's a honeymooner's paradise. So every honeymooning couple from South India at some point must go to Ooty. And what they do as they go along is that they throw food to these macaques. And once you start getting provisioned in this way, it leads to aggressive competition between the females and sometimes the males within these groups for these newly available, rich, but very clumped resources. And this, we feel, has led to a cascade of behavioral changes, social changes, leading to the appearance of a new form of social organization. So if we go to the next slide, I don't have time to actually talk about it, but I can bring it up in the discussion if you'd like. What is most significant here is that the very simple, apparently benevolent, spiritually driven act of feeding monkeys, because whenever I talk to them asking them why they feed monkeys, it's of course for their own benefit, but also for some people, they are feeding a god, perhaps, right? And so whenever this happens, what you don't realize that this act, which is considered virtuous by most Indians, is completely detrimental for the macaques themselves. And if you look at the socio-ecology of these macaque populations at two organizational levels, that of the society and that of the individual, we see the appearance of unusual behavioral repertoires, including novel, gender-specific life history strategies, which could and seem to be actually influencing the evolutionary trajectories of this population in the long term, and very tragically threatens its very existence. And again, I will bring this up in the discussion if need be to say why these changes that we are seeing are actually leading to the decimation of the population, beginning, of course, with a very virtuous act, apparently virtuous act of feeding the monkeys. Now, although Bonnet Macaque troops often live in close associations with humans, adult or juvenile individuals in such troops typically do not display any kind of affiliative interactions with people. I, however, personally obtained one of the earliest evidences to the contrary when I observed a long time ago, beginning in June 1993, a particular adult female, SU, who lived in a troop called GKVK1, which was in the University of Agricultural Sciences, then a distant suburb of Bangalore, today a part of almost central Bangalore, the way the city has grown. SU very unusually started showing a new behavior which nobody seemed to have seen before. She would go to the nearest hostel kitchen, sit on the windowsill of the kitchen where food was being cooked, and from there she would call, "Ooh, ooh." Now this is a call that we've never heard before. The nearest relation, the nearest sort of cousin of this call is when SU would be lost from the rest of the troop and she would say, "Woo!" So that's a call to orient herself with regard to the response that would come, and entirely an auditory signal, and then she would orient with the group. But here she was saying, "Woo," very softly in the kitchen, clearly targeting the person who's doing the cooking, who of course, moved by this very soft appeal, would frequently give food. And this led, therefore, to this kind of a signaling being established, at least within this female. Right? Now, what was remarkable is that I didn't see, of course, any other female ever use this call in a similar situation. BO, who was a 2-year-old daughter of SU's, then began to use this vocalization in a very identical context from November 1994, a year later. And this was a behavioral trait that was possibly transmitted from mother to daughter by social learning. Strikingly, such food requesting by persistent coo calls was, again, later independently observed by me amongst 2 adult females, possibly an aunt and her niece, TI and ND, in one particular troop, BM5, in a geographically distant population, that in the Bandipur National Park, which was again, this was again a troop that lived very close, in close proximity to human habitations, right? So independently, other the population evolved this modified call again. Now, a propensity for individual macaques to regularly interact with and display contact affiliative behaviors towards human observers was, again, I first saw in 4 juvenile individuals, 2 males, MI and DO, and 2 females, the aforementioned BO and SH, again in that same troop, GKVK1, around the same time that BO, who was SU's daughter, began to request for food using her soft coo calls. Remarkably, all these individuals, ranging in age from 1 to 4 years, were offspring of SU, right? Who was also unique amongst the 11 adult females in that group in exhibiting a very high level of tolerance of human observers. All the other 10 females would at some point over that 4 years threaten me. She never did, not even once during those 4 years. What was also very interesting is that SU was unusual in displaying very high levels of play behavior with her 4 juvenile offspring, which no other adult female in the troop did. They may have, occasionally played once or twice, but never as systematically or regularly as SU did. And this, therefore, led to the question that SU's offspring may have learned to be tolerant or even sociable by observing her behavioral interactions with other humans, with other species, humans, but also, she was also the only female which regularly interacted with the males in the group. None of the other females did it to the extent that she did. So she was obviously a very sociable individual, and clearly it seemed that her 4 offspring had either learned from their mother, and this I'm calling affective again in a way, of just learning how to approach people, to interact with them. Of course, being a true biologist, I cannot rule out the fact that this sociable temperament may have also been contributed by a genetic sort of predisposition to display preferentially affiliative behaviors amongst the members of this particular macaque matriline. Moving on, a most unexpected change that happened in this macaque-human relationship subsequently occurred in the aftermath of the social change that I talked about earlier in Bandipur, where we had a new social formation that came up. Here what happened was that in one particular troop, which we call Camp 2, in this population, juvenile macaques started to directly communicate with human benefactors, those who offered them food. This took on the form of a very novel, and again I would argue affectual, food requesting behavior directed towards food-bearing tourists who were visiting the sanctuary, and which usually successfully resulted in food being thrown at the individual. Now, what makes this communication, which has never ever been reported in wild monkeys anywhere in the world, what makes this interaction unique is that it is invariably directed only towards another primate species, humans, and never towards their own conspecific macaques. It is multimodal in nature and typically includes a newly evolved gesture of raising an arm towards the human, a soft coo call, which is rarely, as I said, used otherwise, and a visually mediated orientating behavior that allows the macaque to lock gaze with the human benefactor while the individual macaque continuously monitors the response of the human, all of which we have shown are performed intentionally and with the hand extension gesture, possibly even referentially. So I will show this in the, and hopefully this will work again, thanks to Manoj's efforts. Yes.
No. No. Again. Again. No.
So what you couldn't possibly hear because the sound is low is basically this. He's waiting there, looking, and when their eyes meet, or even before their eyes meet, he would go, oh, oh. And as soon as their eyes meet, he puts out a hand, right? So this is a novel gesture. Nobody has ever seen this. In fact, around the same time when we reported it, 2 other groups actually reported rhesus and long-tailed macaques, but only in captivity, interacting with their human trainers, having learned to develop this gesture. But this was the only documentation where in the wild, individuals seem to have evolved a new multimodal system. So basically, you are tracking who has food, and we've done natural experiments with human volunteers where we have shown that this response comes only when people are carrying food. You can carry food in your hand and walk, or you can walk with your empty palms facing upwards. If you're walking with an empty palm, a monkey will not follow you, will not communicate with you. If you have food, he or she will. And all she or she will do is she'll continuously monitor you, actually look at the food. If you turn back, she will come in front of you so that she's locking eyes with you, continuously calling, ooh, ooh. And the moment your eyes lock, she holds up her hand, right? So this is basically what this communication is all about. And the hand extension gesture, as I said, is produced by the monkeys only when there is a joint visual attention state established with the human recipient, as evaluated in terms of the 2 subjects exhibiting complete body orientation towards one another. So this appears to be an entirely novel application of a well-known macaque vocal signal, and we believe that the possible functions of the coo call in the context of food requesting could be either 1, to attract the visual attention of the human subjects during interaction, 2, as a signal to express the macaque's intent to acquire food held by the humans, or 3, even one that serves to maintain persistent contact of the signaling individuals with the human audience. This gesture could thus function to express the internal motivational state of the actor or respond to the external events experienced by her or both. At a more general level, however, the affectual nature of this signal and its effect on the intended audience is unquestionable. Now, how did this novel affective behavioral strategy originate? We think that primates generally do not share food with actively with their conspecifics and are more likely to aggressively defend food resources from them. Adult bonnet macaques in Bandipur rarely displayed the food requesting behaviors while interacting with them, with humans. Either they would snatch food, either they would snatch food from people, or they would threaten. The adults would tend to threaten them, and so that the humans get afraid and throw them the food, but only the juveniles would actually establish this kind of a communicative context with them. And so this seems to be an alternative foraging tactic, which is rather affective in nature. And given that juveniles are both small-bodied, they are generally afraid of humans, we feel that this is perhaps the most effective strategy that they have been able to evolve, and possibly it got reinforced when they held out their hand, possibly trying to reach for the food, which they of course can't, but which led to the people responding by saying, oh, it's asking for food, and you give it food, and it gets reinforced, right? Now here, I suggest that this opportunity to request food from humans could potentially have presented itself as an affordance, or more specifically what Eric Reitveld has referred to in 2012 as a bodily potentiating affordance, which is experienced as having what he calls an affective allure. This is also what Hubert Dreyfus and Sean Kelly have referred to in 2007, and I quote them, an experience in which the world solicits a certain kind of activity, unquote. Reitveld, in an earlier paper in 2008, has argued that such actions shown by the macaques in this case could then be interpreted as manifestations of an unreflective, embodied intelligence, or what John McDowell calls embodied coping skills in a paper in 2007, responding to a particularly relevant affordance that presents itself in a certain facilitating environment. It is important to note here that such actions could be unreflective or typically performed without mediation of explicit deliberation or reflection, while the displayed responsiveness to the affordance is concernful, is full of concern in that it takes into account what matters most at that time to the macaques. Their current needs, interests, or preferences. Clearly, the human recognizes that there is a need of the macaque to obtain food, and she then responds to it. This behavior, once displayed, could have then become reinforced and ritualized when positively rewarded for by human beings who may have either been affectually or emotionally driven to respond to this unusual embodied appeal. We further argue that the inherently biological nature of such embodied affective responses is indicated by the co-option of the soft coo call, typically by juvenile macaques, but also by certain adult females, as I showed earlier, independently in two populations, as well as the development of a new gesture, that of hand extension, in one particular population, both of these populations being forced to adapt to a novel, though similar, human-influenced environment. It's a novel environment for them. It's also important to note that this successful behavioral strategy, ontogenetically produced during bodily development in one or more individuals, may have then spread by social learning mechanisms such as social facilitation or emulation within the population. We started off with one female macaque who started doing this, and at the time when we actually wrote up the paper, which was 2 years ago, 17 of the juveniles were using the same strategy, right? Our observation that this particular behavioral performance arose independently in two geographically separate populations also suggests that bonnet macaques, given their unparalleled social flexibility and adaptability, may even be genetically predisposed to respond behaviorally, though unreflectively, to certain affordances in this situation through a combination of communication signals of different modalities in order to obtain an affective goal. These individuals remarkably thus appear to be capable of developing, refining, and learning a fairly complex communicative strategy that is usually directed at will within their lifetimes. Now, we've also documented, and I'll very quickly go through, I'll finish in another 2-3 minutes. We've also documented the appearance of certain other novel behaviors directed towards humans within particular bonnet macaque troops in the Bandipur population that again seems to have spread across individuals within the groups within their lifetimes, that is, within one generation. Our observations of these behavioral innovations and their spread clearly rule out the involvement of any genetic causation and suggest that their rapid spread may be primarily mediated through largely affective processes of social learning. And this is an example, and I won't go too much into the details, where 3 particular individuals, 2 males and 1 female, all of them on the top of the hierarchy, learned at some point of time that if they came, so they would be sitting by the roadside, and when a car of tourists comes by and they're curious about the monkeys, they stop. All 3 of them would stand up on their hind legs and hold out their hands. Now, this invariably led to people giving them food. It's a kind of a modification of the earlier behavior that we were talking about, and this was taken to a dramatic form by one particular adult male in one particular troop who would do this in the middle of the road. So he would be sitting there, and as soon as he saw a bus or a car appearing, he would go to the middle of the road and stand up with his hands up, and invariably the cars would stop because they don't want to run over him. And the moment they stopped, he would quickly run to the side and do this again, and he would invariably get food, right? And of course, one day he disappeared, and we hope that he didn't really go under one of these trucks or buses. But what's also fascinating, and we have not written about it, is that they knew which buses to stop. So if any of you have traveled to Ooty by the white Rajhamsa buses, they are non-air conditioned, and that makes it convenient for people to throw out food, for monkeys to get in, and invariably, this male would stop the white Rajhamsa buses. He wouldn't do it for the red buses or the other air-conditioned buses because people were not going to throw out food. So clearly, there is much more than we have understood so far about how they learn, particular, again, what I would call an affective environment in which to show or display certain kinds of behaviors. Now, coming to the last point that I wanted to make is that affective exchanges that occur between humans and commensal macaques could also be mediated by humans. These are typically shown in response to the apparently sentient communicative gestures directed by the monkeys towards them. As for example, when juvenile bonnet macaques, as I said in Bandipur, request food with outstretched hands, or when juvenile rhesus macaques, another commensal Indian primate, approach banana vendors in the old city of Delhi, sitting down on their haunches and coo-calling gently while staring intently at their potential benefactors. The non-human calls and eye contact are tactile, fingery sounds, haptic eyes, which are meant to touch and be touched. They are remarkably effective in evoking affects of empathy from their targeted humans. A biscuit or a rusk or a banana would be tossed or held in the vendor's hands, whereupon the macaque runs to take it before retreating to consume the morsel in safety. The sweet taste of the rusk is realized through simian taste, and whilst the encounter is brief, it is a small story in a very expansive urban ecology, a story that brings a more than human sensorium to the fore, where affects are haptic, optic, or even gustatory. Now, in Bandipur also, I will just tell you this little story of one macaque. Of course, we have banana vendors in Bandipur who are waiting to sell bananas to tourists who is, of course, buying them to feed the monkeys. And the macaques would often try and snatch bananas from the vendor himself. And of course, in this case, he would have this big stick, And so they learned quickly that, this wasn't very profitable. At this point, one of the males, adult males, in fact, he was earlier an alpha male, later deposed, he developed this amazing relationship with the banana vendor where he would come very quietly and sit next to him about 6 inches away, patiently. He's not doing anything, he's just sitting there. And after a while, the banana vendor, when he's sort of given out his bananas, he gets a moment of respite, he gives him a banana. So he takes it, he goes away, doesn't come back for 2 to 3 hours, 4 hours, maybe later in the day, maybe the next day. But then he'll come again and sit very quietly next to him, not making any attempt to create it, and he gets a banana. So this was a very abiding relationship. And of course, clearly it had much more longer term benefits for the macaque than just that immediate banana. And so clearly individuals were able to adapt to many of these affective environments in very deep ways, I think. So Man and I have thus been concerned about, as you saw here, and if you would go to the next slide, processes of urbanization across our country. We are trying to track how urban metabolization results in transformation of macaque life worlds in the city, and how our shared histories are constituted and effectively sensed by both people and macaques. The commensal ecologies that urban metabolization fuels are primarily shaped by the city's human-driven metabolic flows, their intensities, and often, as I just provided a glimpse into, the urban citizens' practices of sharing food with the macaques. On Tuesdays and Saturdays, days considered special in terms of Hanuman worship, for example, in Delhi, large-scale feeding of rhesus macaques occur in public areas. Devotees, often instructed by priests, offer fruit, vegetables, and cooked savories to the monkeys. To feed is to receive punya, a diffuse cleansing merit from God. And through this dhan, or gift, volatile energies are harnessed for an individual's protection. Passerbys stop and buy bananas from street vendors, handing them out to eagerly awaiting troops. The affluent middle class transport food in cars, strewing out sacks of pulses, fruits, and vegetables by the roadside and parks that are populated densely by these macaques. These acts are seen to bring achhi kismet, or good fortune. Being messmates, the next slide please. Being messmates, company who eat at the same table, lies at the heart of macaque commensality. Food becomes a point where mutual interests of macaques and people overlap, a convergence that is simultaneously material, semiotic, and affective, reconfiguring macaque ethologies, reconstituting their urban lives. Macaques distinguish between natural and nutritionally rich provision foods, and even alter their foraging strategies, as I showed, to access human origin foods. They move down from buildings and terraces towards spaces in temples where and when devotees arrive. These ethological dispositions of macaques, extending their hands to take food, their upright posture, visual cues communicated through their faces, whether in the forest or in the city, are all affective, generating responses of sympathy and care. What are the more global implications of these novel affective relationships that are developing rapidly as our macaque populations become increasingly urbanized and the lives of individual macaques even more intimately and intricately entangled with those of humans? In 2002, Jennifer Walsh, in a very classic paper, said, and I quote her, "Animals themselves are critical to the making of places and landscapes." How, unquote. How then do animals transform and appropriate the environment for their own? Or in other words, how are animal spaces, which are decided upon by people, inexorably but gently replaced by beastly places that the non-humans, or in this case macaques, are able to affectively themselves establish? We believe this to be a productive arena for future interdisciplinary exploration, examining urbanization as a continuous de- and re-territorialization of space through modes of composition and movement between people and macaques, but perhaps even more importantly, through the development of unique affective relationships between the different species that are increasingly sharing their dwellings with one another. This would enable a more sophisticated analysis of multi-species ecologies and also potentially generate new ways of thinking about the future in contexts where macaques and humans inhabit common worlds with shared histories. Let me now finally return to the lonely macaque as she patiently waits at the corner of this road, expecting her handout of food in an increasingly anthropogenic world. Our recent understandings of performance and performativity in gender theory allow us to consider the food requesting actions of the macaques as iterated bodily practices by agential individuals that produce tangible material effects. These affective performances thus emerge within a specific location, a natural cultural contact zone where humans and non-humans encounter and relate to one another through specific exchanges of signals and materials. The gradually synerbizing forests of Bandipur thus become a fertile and heterogeneous space where relationships between two phylogenetically related species are improvised and affectively ritualized within very unequal relations of power. Furthermore, we visualize that the affectivity of the individual actors engaged in these relational practices lead to the co-creation of new forms of subjectivity within these changing spaces of interaction, a feature that we will possibly encounter with other non-humans too in the Anthropocene. We thus hope to transcend the human exceptionalism that has automatically been built into the behavioral ecology approach of understanding non-human species and reconceptualize the macaques as subjects in an intersubjective affective negotiation with humans. This, we feel, is a reorientation that is an urgent imperative. Do these performances then embody the macaques' last desperate affectual bid to cope with the loss of their habitats and resources to a far more powerful species, a final act of negotiation with a world quietly slipping away from their grasp? Let me end as a response, and again, I think I've realized now increasingly when I speak to audiences, what works best is poetry, is art. And here I've particularly kept it low because there'll be a poem that will come up now. But here is a drawing by Bruegel the Elder, who in the 17th century portrays the rich city of Antwerp. Much of the rich, and of course you can't see, but there are rich merchant ships arriving in Antwerp harbor, mainly spoils of colonial power in Africa, which the Dutch sort of initiated. But in the foreground, Bruegel talks of these two monkeys in chains sitting there. And this particular painting inspired Wisława Szymborska, the Polish Nobel laureate. And I would encourage all of you to read her because I think she perhaps has the smallest body of literature amongst all Nobel laureates in literature that I know of, but all of it extremely powerful because she talks of everyday life. And when she saw this painting, she composed a poem which I think is one of the most profoundly moving poems that I've ever read. And if I may have the next slide. And this is what she writes. This is what I see in my dreams about final exams. Two monkeys chained to the floor sit on the windowsill. The sky behind them flutters. The sea is taking its bath. The exam is history of mankind. I stammer and hedge. One monkey stares and listens with mocking disdain. The other seems to be dreaming away. But when it's clear, I don't know what to say, he prompts me with a gentle clinking of his chain. Thank you.